Schönen Nachmittag. Good afternoon. And thank you very much, Secretary General, for these very kind introductory words. I apologize in advance for my voice, which I hope will be able to hold until the end of my presentation. It is truly an honor to be here today and have the opportunity to present the Global State of Democracy report that International IDEA has been working on for the past 2 years. My name is Adina, and as the Secretary General mentioned, I was part of the core team developing this publication. This new biannual publication of International IDEA is basically a global health check on democracy. And when we conceptualized it, we wanted to go beyond the traditional target audience of policymakers. We also wanted it to be useful for citizens, for civil society organizations, for journalists, but also for academics, for students, basically the people of this audience. In my presentation today, I would like to give you a brief overview over the content and the main messages of the publication, and hopefully ignite your interest to read all its 300 pages, or at least its overview. And if you would like to save some trees and not carry the publication around in your briefcase, you can always read the entire report and additional background material on the IDEA website that you can see at the bottom of the screen. So, what does the publication actually analyze? Firstly, the publication gives a comprehensive overview of global and regional democracy trends since 1975, a year which also coincides with two key UN conventions, the one on civil and political rights and on economic and social rights. Then the publication also examines some of the key challenges that democracy is facing today, including the impact of modern democratic backsliding that the Secretary General was referring to. Last but not least, the publication also explores the conditions under which democracy can be resilient. And in order to be able to conduct this analysis, International IDEA developed a new and unique set of democracy indices, which serve as the main evidence base for this report. So, this is basically an infographic of our indices. And International IDEA's Global State of Democracy Indices measure different aspects of democracy during the period 1975 to 2015 in 155 countries around the world. As you heard from the Secretary General, it is a lot of data. They're centered around International IDEA's broad definition of democracy, which the Secretary General also referred to, and which we define as popular control over public decision-making and decision-makers, and equality of the citizens in the exercise of that control. The uniqueness of the indices is that they don't offer a binary, simplistic view of the quality of democracy, but a holistic one. Normally, when I try to explain it to people, including my own kids, I try to say that it's a little bit like black and white TV versus color TV, right? You can have black or white, two colors, good or bad. Or you can have a multitude of colors which portray the world more truthful to how it is. These indices, they take into account key elements of democracy which go beyond the existence of elections or democratic institutions. As such, the indices are constructed around the 5 key attributes that were mentioned earlier, which each in its turn is divided into several sub-attributes. Now, I'm not sure you can read from the screen, but I'm just quickly going to go through some of the aspects that the indices are covered. And please note that I'm saying indices as a plural and not index as a singular, because what our index doesn't do is it doesn't offer one democracy score. Our indices doesn't rank on whether or not you are or you aren't a democracy. This is the the reference I made earlier to the binary black and white TV versus the color TV. The 5 attributes are representative government, which looks at clean elections, inclusive suffrage, free political parties, and elected government. We're also looking at fundamental rights, checks on governments, which looks at how effective parliaments are, for example, if there is judicial independence, and if there is media integrity. We also look at impartial administrations, which, for example, looks at corruption and predictable enforcement. And last but not least, we look at participatory engagement, which looks at civil society, a very important part of a functioning democracy. We also look at direct democracy, electoral participation, and subnational elections. As you can see, these indices are designed to give a comprehensive and nuanced picture of the quality of democracy. And this is in line with International IDEA's view that democracy is a continuous process of development. It's not a perfect status quo that can be achieved. As I mentioned, these attributes cannot be aggregated into one single democracy score. Individual attributes, so these 4 out of these 5, can be compared on a country, regional, and national level for a period of 40 years. And I would really encourage you to explore the indices when you can. They are really a true goldmine of data. This is a little bit what the indices webpage looks like when you go into it. And if I would have more time, I would love to show you how it is to play around with it. But we especially conceptualize it in such a way so both statisticians and data analysts find it useful together with students who are 15, 16 years old. It's very self-explanatory, it's very interesting, and it's very easy to use. So please note down the address, and you can look at your own country, you can compare it to a region or to another country. You can look at the development over time, and if you don't have the time, there's even a cheat button. There is a very quick facts button at the top right where you can just click and then you can see how your country looks in 2015. Now that I briefly covered what was analyzed and which evidence base we used, let's now take a look at some of the main findings from the global state of democracy. The key findings can be condensed into 2 main messages. 1, democracy is at a crossroads. And 2, democratic backsliding does not weaken people's ideas of democracy. And I would now like to elaborate a little bit more on both of these. So, democracy is at a crossroads. What do we mean by that? Basically, that depending on the perspective, the glass is both half full and half empty. From a long-term global perspective, the glass is half full. The trend since 1975 suggests that most aspects of democracy have improved, and that most democracies have been resilient over time. Moreover, current democratic regressions have generally been short-lived and followed by recovery. However, and this is the half-empty glass, or 2/3 empty, as some of my colleagues might say, when zooming in on a country level or regional level, in the past 5 to 10 years, we see critical challenges and threats to democracy. But let's start with the good news. Contrary to common negative views that democracy is in decline, when seen from a global and long-term perspective, the picture is rather optimistic. Democracy has shown remarkable signs of resilience. Data from International IDEA's new Global State of Democracy Indices show that the world has experienced continued and steep democratic progress since the mid-1970s in almost all aspects of democracy. Today, 68% of countries can be described as electoral democracies, compared to only 38% in 1975. Elections have become more common and cleaner, with less fraud, manipulation, and irregularities. Political parties are facing fewer barriers to organize and participate in elections. Women's participation in parliament has doubled worldwide in the last 20 years, from 11% in 1995 to 23.5% in 2015. It's still very low, but it has more than doubled. Governments are now more representative of and accountable to their constituencies. More countries respect the fundamental rights of their citizens. The areas of social rights and equality have seen significant improvements. Governments are more constrained by checks of from parliament, the judiciary, and the media. To sum up, global progress has been made in 4 out of 5 key aspects of democracy since 1975. The only exception is the impartial administration one, which has remained the same, as levels of corruption and the rule of law have stagnated since 1975. Now that's that purple line. And this might seem like not much of a gain, but if you look at it from a long-term perspective and actually look at how it has increased, this is the whole world. Democracy is not in decline, and it's definitely not dying, right? So these are just a few highlights, but the interesting part is that this remarkable progress has been visible in all regions, although, of course, at different speeds and with stark differences within a region. So, to sum up, these findings really challenge the pessimistic view that both I and you have surely read about in the past years. Democracy is not extremely fragile or generally in decline, at least not from a long-term perspective. Remember the half-full glass? Now, this rapid and steep progress has unfortunately slowed down since the 1990s. And in the past 5 to 10 years, all these positive developments are now increasingly being threatened by several critical challenges to democracy in individual countries and regions. International IDEA has identified the following set of challenges as being particularly critical to democracy today: the changing nature of political parties and representation, inequality and social exclusion, money, influence, corruption and state capture, migration, social polarization, and integration, democracy and peace building in post-conflict transitions. And if unaddressed, these challenges could stall or reverse the global progress made in the past 40 years. And I would now like to give you an overview of the analysis of these challenges as described in our chapters. As we know, democracy relies on effective representation, right? It's from demos, the people. Yet, political representation through political parties is challenged by the increased levels of disengagement, distrust, and disillusion towards traditional political parties and actors. Many citizens today question whether traditional political parties can handle current challenges and crises, increasing apathy and distrust among voters. It has also encouraged many to support alternative paths of political action, thus triggering the rise of ideologically extremist parties and movements. And I think that you all have examples of this. Political parties are amongst the least trusted institutions in society, and that level of trust in political parties has decreased in all regions except for Asia and the Pacific and Europe, where it has stagnated or declined since 1994. A healthy, resilient democracy is based on inclusiveness, which political parties and representative institutions are in a key position to safeguard. Yet, parties find this hard to implement, particularly as women and young people are largely excluded from representative government institutions. Did you know that only 5% of young people in Europe are members of a political party? 5%? Political movements that grow out of citizens' protest and are characterized by anti-establishment rhetorics are a rising phenomenon. Over the past 10 years, these movements have most often transformed into populist political entities when their political goals required a hold on legislative power. Party membership numbers reflect how citizens relate to traditional party politics. And overall, party membership has steadily declined since 1994 in Asia and the Pacific, Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, and North America, and in Africa since 2005. In the Middle East and Iran, funnily enough, party membership appears to be on the rise. Protest has become an increasing popular and legitimate form of expressing political opinions, particularly as democracies evolve. Countries with higher level of social rights and equality also have a citizenry that more actively protests, as we can see, for example, in the United States. This suggests that countries with a stronger and healthier democracy also have higher levels of protest participation. But in any case, not trusted, not feeling represented, or being able to influence politics results in a declining voter membership and voter turnout, even in established democracies. And political parties and anti-establishment rhetorics are rising out of this protest. Populist parties are gaining ground, more than doubling since 1975, according to the World Value Survey. So, what should political parties do? In order to remain relevant and to be able to function as true representatives of the population, political parties must adjust. They must work really hard and prioritize restoring trust and consciously work together towards a greater inclusion of youth, women, and marginalized groups. If such large proportions of the populations are excluded from political parties, how can you be democratic? But they should also learn from new successful organizations how to interact with the electorate. And they should also try to democratize decision-making, for example, with the help of new technologies. And also not to forget, political parties are not just there for elections. They need to learn how to communicate with the electorate throughout the political cycle and not just ahead of elections. Because the problem of this widening gap between political actors and the population can lead to a very big gap also in democratic accountability. And this is also reflected in another key challenge for democracy, inequality. Rising inequality has become one of the defining challenges of the century. While poverty levels have decreased globally since 1980, and inequality between countries has been reduced, inequality within countries has increased. In addition, the effects of inequality, including poverty, now affect young people more than the older generation for the first time in history. Inequality has profound implications for the health and resilience of democracies everywhere. An unequal distribution of wealth and power has a significant detrimental effect on the quality of governance, since it limits effective service delivery and impedes social cohesion. Inequality feeds social polarization and shrinks the vital moderate center of societies. Inequality creates an imbalance in voice, representation, opportunity, and access that disenfranchises whole segments of the population and therefore also undermines trust in democratic institutions. It can ignite social unrest and increase tensions between different groups within a society, potentially leading to violent conflict. So, if democracy is to prove resilient and sustainable over time, it urgently needs to address inequality. In this chapter, International Idea analyzes the different ways in which inequality affects democracy, but also the inverse, how democratic politics affect inequality. It also comes with a set of messages, key messages, and recommendations. And one major reason which contributes to rising inequalities and the gap between the have and the have-not is also corruption, which, when it is linked to politics, poses serious threats to democracy. Now, I think that all of us have heard about scandals involving money in politics, because they have affected countries in every region of the world. Corruption scandals affect perceptions on democracy. They cause citizens to lose trust in political parties, politicians, and institutions, and inspire protest or deep indignation. Even when money is poured legally into politics, the disproportionate effect large donors, for example, can have undermines the integrity of the political system by making it vulnerable to political capture. This so-called big money also provides a disproportionate advantage to a selected few and creates an uneven playing field, especially, again, for women and marginalized groups. In addition, current measures to combat these problems often fall short because they have a limited scope and the institutions that are supposed to enforce them are limited with constraints, while political parties face little accountability. So it is really no wonder that our global state of democracy indices show that corruption has been the most difficult issue to address in the past 40 years, and it hasn't seen any improvement since then. So, what is needed? In our opinion, a wider, holistic approach is necessary to curb this challenge. This more holistic approach should include a combination of improved anti-corruption mechanism, new oversight instruments led by a variety of social and political actors, and enhanced political party regulations. In addition, improved anti-money laundering systems, a vibrant civil society and media that can effectively function as watchdogs, and crowdfunding efforts to raise many small donations as a counterbalance to big money could be some of the action that can be taken in this regard. As Nelson Mandela said, we must work together to ensure the equitable distribution of wealth, opportunity, and power in our society. And from one quote to the other, one significant litmus test of the strength and resilience of a democratic system is how global people movement will be managed. Erika Feller, Assistant High Commissioner of the UNHCR. And I don't know what you think, but I actually think it's true. How migration, both in destination and origin countries, is managed has an impact on democracy. We chose to add this topic as a global challenge for democracy, as it is increasingly at the center of public and political debate, and as such has played an important role in the outcome of recent elections and referenda. Integrating migrants into their new countries has proven a difficult task for many democracies, and unsuccessful attempts have in some cases contributed to an increased support for nationalistic and populistic parties. Can you think of any? Yeah, I think I can. Both in my own home country, but I think also in the country where we're in right now. Anyway, in this chapter, we assess the democratic dividend of migration for destination and origin countries. We look at how policymakers can effectively address public concern of migration, but whilst also reaping the benefits of inclusive and multicultural integration politics. And the analysis on how migration affects democracy is primarily done on the basis on how politically inclusive countries are of immigrants, but also of how immigrants can be actors and agents of democracy, for example, through the diaspora. And now comes the interesting part. Data from the International Idea Global State of Democracy Indices and data from MIPEX, which is the Migration Policy Indices, suggest that there is a correlation between political systems that are open or inclusive in terms of their political integration of migrants and countries that score highly in terms of the quality of their democracy. As such, International Idea assesses that an important element for tackling the challenge of migration should be the political integration of legal migrants, including refugees and asylum seekers. Some of the elements for enabling political integration are easing the granting of citizenship, allowing immigrants to vote or stand in elections, particularly at the local level, and encouraging political parties to ensure that their internal policies treat migrants equally and facilitate their ability to be candidates in election. And the same notion of political inclusion needed with respect to tackling the challenge of migration is also needed in post-conflict environments. Ban Ki-moon said, "Exclusion is one of the most important factors that trigger a relapse into conflict." Post-conflict periods present opportunities to build democratic institutions that can prevent future conflict. This chapter recommends that targeted and active inclusion should be prioritized in peace-building processes, with the understanding that if transition processes are inclusive, nationally owned, open and democratic, the resulting democratic system will be resilient. Inclusion, both social and political, must go beyond quotas and numerical representation. Inclusion should be encouraged in constitution-building processes, elections, and political settlements, because this will enable access to decision-making and foster the growth of new local stakeholders who are interested in the democratic process. And this, in its turn, reduces the chances of conflict reoccurrence and ensures a resilient democracy. In addition, with the increased global movement and migration, it is important to move away from encouraging narrow group identities that conflict with other narrowly defined groups. Instead, they may increasingly choose to build and foster political institutions that reward consensus and seek the benefits of diversity. Because if people feel that they have a stake in the decisions, they are more likely to respect the rules and stay politically engaged in the long term. Now to the last challenge, and this is the one that the Secretary General referred to, namely the modern democratic backsliding. It has become an increasingly common phenomenon today. In the past 10 years, the world has witnessed an increased number of countries backslide, but through democratic means. So instead of coup d'etats and electoral fraud, which are examples of traditional backsliding mechanisms, leaders with authoritarian tendencies are now increasing their power by manipulating the very instruments of democracy in their favor. This results, for example, in extended term limits, the concentration of power in executive branches, decreased autonomy for the judiciary, the media, and weakened opportunities for political opposition, all legally, all within the framework of democracy. Now, these actions have a ripple effect on the functioning of institutions beyond those directly targeted and affect people's safety, well-being, and livelihoods. Some countries have shown their resilience and capacity to recover from these dangerous paths towards authoritarianism, leveraging people's resistance and championing the role of the courts, parliaments, political parties, the media, and regional organizations. So our conclusions in the chapter are that courts have been crucial in limiting attempts by executive authorities to increase their power by manipulating the constitution. Parliaments can also curtail attempts to excessively expand executive power. The media is also an important catalyst for limiting or counteracting democratic backsliding. And people are important agents of resistance. Because after countries experience democratic backsliding, people's positive perception of democracy actually increased. And this leads me to the second key finding, which I mentioned in the beginning, which is that in the cases of modern democratic backsliding, when leaders with authoritarian tendencies increase their power by manipulating the instruments of democracy, as recently seen in countries such as Venezuela, Hungary, or Poland, people's attitudes towards democracy are not weakened. Public opinion data shows that citizens' view and value of democracy is strengthened in the face of such threats. One might say, you don't miss it until you're almost losing it, right? So, what about democracy? Is it resilient? Well, if citizens are strongly committed to democracy, it will persist as a permanent ideal. Improving democracy's resilience begins with establishing or restoring citizens' trust in the efficiency of democratic politics and defending it. Citizens' engagement and the presence of a strong civil society are critical for democracy's resilience. Solid democratic institutions and the prevalence of multiple checks and balances decreases the likelihood that democracy can be fully captured by any branch of government or actors. Autonomous, capable, independent institutions such as parliaments, judiciaries, and prosecutors can provide those checks and balances. Innovation is also key in a rapidly changing world, where technology constantly changes how we communicate with each other. Democratic resilience can also be designed to strengthen inclusivity, meaningful representation, accountability, and electoral integrity. But in the end, democracy doesn't happen by chance. It is shaped by actions, both big and small, taken by people all over the world. We all need to do our part to safeguard democracy.
The challenge for me of always having to prove myself that I can do it. I can do it as a black person. I can do it as a woman in my own country.
Bei einer Eltern könnte man sehen, dass in den nächsten 20 Jahren da nichts passieren wird. Überhaupt nie was passieren wird bis zum letzten Tag. Und das war der Grund für mich, für meine Flucht.
The regime had the monopoly on media. I knew that people were dying. I had to talk about that. They were not telling the truth.
Democracy is not like the Andeans, that it's there forever. It's like a garden that you have to water every day.
Thank you very much for listening.